Hi, welcome back. Good to see you. This is an original story from Hidden Revenge Family, and it took a turn you truly didn't see coming. Let's get into it.
The rain started before sunrise. By the time I reached Arlington National Cemetery, it had settled into a steady, cold sheet that soaked through wool and pride alike. The sky was low and gray, the kind of morning that made everything quieter than usual. Even the gravel under my boots sounded respectful. Grandpa Thomas always said he didn't want a big scene when he died. He also said he didn't trust politicians and never liked overcooked steak. He got 2 out of 3. There were black SUVs lined up along the curb, men in tailored coats, women in dark designer dresses that probably cost more than my first car. I recognized some of them from old fundraisers, defense contractors, local officials, business partners, who suddenly remembered they loved Grandpa the moment his obituary mentioned decorated veteran. The honor guard was already in position near the casket. Crisp uniforms, white gloves, faces set in disciplined calm. The American flag draped tight across polished wood, not a wrinkle out of place. I walked toward the entrance gate in a plain black coat I'd owned for years. No makeup, hair pulled back, no jewelry except the silver ring on my right hand. It looked cheap if you didn't know what it was. That was the point. 5 years. 5 years since anyone in my family had seen me in public. 5 years since I disappeared. That's what Becca liked to call it, disappeared. Like I'd run off with a drummer or joined a cult. The gate clicked open as guests filtered through. I stepped forward. Stop. Her voice cut through the rain. Becca stood just inside the gate under a large black umbrella held by someone else. Of course. She wore a tailored black coat with a high collar, sharp heels sinking slightly into the wet ground, but not enough to ruin the look. Diamond studs in her ears, hair perfectly set despite the weather. She looked like she was attending a networking event, not burying our grandfather. 2 private security guards stood behind her. Big guys, earpieces. The kind that scan the crowd like they expect snipers at a funeral. She stared at me like she was trying to place a face from an old yearbook. Then her mouth curved. Well, she said loud enough for half the guests to hear. Look who finally decided to show up. Conversations around us thinned. Heads turned. I stopped 3 feet from her. I'm here for Grandpa, I said. She let out a short laugh. Sharp, practiced. You don't get to say his name. A few of the guests shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned in. I sent flowers, I added. I called when what she cut in. When you were done hiding, the word hung there. Hiding. I wasn't hiding. Her eyes flashed. She raised her voice. You vanished for 5 years. No explanation. No visits. No holidays. And now you think you can just walk in here and sit in the family row. There it was, the performance. I could feel the rain sliding down my collar, soaking through the fabric at my shoulders. Cold, steady, real. I was working, I said. She barked out another laugh. Working, that's cute. She turned slightly, projecting now. For those of you who don't know, this is my sister, the one who walked away from everything, from her duty, from her family. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Becca, I said quietly. But she wasn't interested in quiet. She disgraced this family, she continued. Grandpa spent his life serving this country, and she couldn't even finish her own commitment. The word she wanted was deserter. She'd used it before. I watched her decide whether to go all the way. She did. She's a deserter, Becca said clearly. She ran, and she left us to clean up the mess. The rain got heavier, or maybe I just noticed it more. I didn't react, didn't blink, didn't defend myself. One of the older men near the front frowned. A woman whispered something into her husband's ear. A camera phone appeared briefly before someone lowered it again. I have every right to be here, I said. You lost that right, she snapped. Family seats are reserved, for those who actually showed up. She glanced toward the front row, already filled with executives and people who hadn't visited Grandpa once during his chemo treatments. I had. I was the one who adjusted his oxygen mask at 3 a.m., the one who learned the rhythm of his breathing when the pain meds kicked in, the one who sat in silence when he couldn't speak but didn't want to be alone. Becca had sent gift baskets. You don't get to rewrite history, she said. I'm not, I replied. She stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough to feel personal, but loud enough for the crowd to stay engaged. You embarrassed us, she said. You embarrassed him. My pulse stayed steady. Training does that. Behind her, I noticed a senior officer standing near the casket. 4 stars on his shoulder, tall, rigid posture. His gaze moved between Becca and me, unreadable. Becca straightened. "You are not part of this family anymore," she declared. "And you are not stepping foot inside the ceremony." The security guards shifted. I looked past her at the flag on the casket, at the rain darkening the edges of the fabric, at the honor guard holding position without flinching. "Move," I said calmly. One of the guards stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said, firm but controlled, "we're going to need you to leave the premises." Becca folded her arms. "Escort her out," she said. There it was, the final line. The guard reached for my arm. Cold fingers brushed my coat sleeve. I didn't pull away. I didn't argue. I just looked at Becca, really looked at her. At the perfect mascara, the tight jaw, the hunger in her eyes that had nothing to do with grief. "You're making a mistake," I said. She smiled, slow, victorious. "No," she replied. "I'm correcting one." The guard applied pressure, guiding me back toward the gate. My boots slid slightly on the wet stone. The iron gate swung open behind me with a metallic groan, and then it slammed shut. The sound echoed sharper than the thunder. For a second, no one moved. Rain soaked through my sleeves. My hair clung to my neck. Water ran down my face, but it wasn't tears. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I didn't beg. I held Becca's gaze through the bars of the gate. Then I lifted my right hand and adjusted the silver ring on my finger. It was old, scratched, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what it signified, but the 4-star general behind the casket saw it. His eyes widened, not in confusion, in recognition. He took one slow step forward, still inside the ceremony grounds, staring directly at my hand. Becca didn't notice. She was too busy turning back to her audience, smoothing her coat, reclaiming her spotlight. I stayed where I was in the rain, watching, waiting. Before anything else happens, I want to ask you something. Have you ever stood in a room or outside a gate, knowing the truth about yourself, while everyone else believed the version someone louder decided to tell? Tell me in the comments. I sat in my car and let the heater cough out weak, uneven air. The windshield fogged up almost immediately. I wiped a clear patch with my sleeve and watched the ceremony continue through a blur of rain and marble headstones. The engine rattled the way it always did when idling too long. The car was 12 years old. Paint chipped. Driver's seat cracked down the middle. It wasn't impressive. It also wasn't financed by anyone's ego. Inside the gate, umbrellas tilted in perfect rows. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel for a second. The metal was cold, steady, solid. 5 years ago, I moved back into Grandpa's farmhouse when the doctor said the cancer had spread to his lungs. Stage 4. They used careful language, manageable, comfort-focused. I'd heard those phrases before. Becca sent a text. "Let me know if it gets serious." It was already serious. I remember the first night I stayed over. Grandpa couldn't sleep flat because the fluid in his chest made him cough, so I propped him up with pillows and sat in a wooden chair beside the bed. Every 30 minutes I checked his oxygen line. Every hour I measured his pulse. I kept a notebook on the dresser and logged his meds like I was back in a field unit. He hated hospitals, said they smelled like bleach and regret, so we kept him home. I learned how to change dressings without flinching, how to cook bland meals he could actually swallow, how to recognize the difference between pain and fear just by the way he gripped the sheets. Becca visited once. She stayed 23 minutes, brought a fruit basket, took photos at the edge of the room, told him she was so busy but thinking of him every day. He squeezed her hand. He always tried to see the best in people. After she left, he looked at me and said, "You don't have to choose this life, Sarah." I told him I already had. Inside the cemetery chapel, a microphone crackled to life. Even through the closed windows of my car, I could faintly hear Becca's voice carried by the speakers they'd set up outside. "I want to honor my grandfather," she began. Tone smooth and measured. A man of legacy. Legacy, she talked about his service record like she'd memorized it off a plaque. Mentioned his medals, his discipline, his sacrifice. She didn't mention the nights he couldn't breathe, or the way his hands shook when the morphine wore off, or how he apologized to me for being a burden. That word stuck. Burden. Halfway through her speech, I saw a man step forward with a leather folder, suit, wire-rimmed glasses. Not Kessler. This was someone else. Probably Becca's attorney. The microphone shifted again. "In accordance with my grandfather's final wishes," Becca said clearly, "I'd like to address something important." I straightened in my seat. Rain tapped against the roof in a steady rhythm. "There has been some confusion about the estate," she continued. But a revised will was signed 3 months before his passing. 3 months. 3 months before he died, Grandpa was in a coma. I know that because I was the one who held his hand when he stopped responding. The attorney opened the folder and began reading. The entirety of the Thomas Whitaker estate, including the family farmland, residential properties, investment accounts, and all military decorations and memorabilia, shall transfer solely to my granddaughter, Rebecca Whitaker. My jaw tightened. Furthermore, the attorney continued, no additional claims shall be recognized by any other family members. No additional claims, the guests murmured. Some nodded approvingly. Becca stood tall, calm, controlled. The farmland alone was worth millions now. Developers had been circling for years. Grandpa refused to sell, said it wasn't about the money. The medals were priceless. Bronze Star, Silver Star, unit commendations, documents from operations that were never fully declassified. I wasn't thinking about the money. I was thinking about the date, 3 months before his death. I reached into my glove compartment and pulled out my old notebook. The same one I used to track his meds. I kept it. Didn't know why at the time. Maybe habit. I flipped to the page from that week. Day 143. Respiratory decline. Oxygen increased to 4 liters. Non-responsive to verbal stimuli. Day 146. Full coma, no eye movement, no reaction to pain. 3 months before he died was day 151. He hadn't spoken, hadn't opened his eyes, hadn't moved voluntarily, and somehow, according to this revised will, he signed legal documents transferring everything to Becca. I let out a slow breath. Forgery, not sloppy, not accidental, deliberate. Inside the chapel, Becca's voice softened. My sister chose to walk away from this family, she said. And Grandpa understood that some people can't carry responsibility. There it was again. Burden, responsibility. She was building a story, painting me as unstable, absent, unreliable. The general I'd seen earlier stood near the back now, arms behind his back, expression unreadable. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. No signal in this weather. Fine. I leaned back in the seat and closed my eyes for a moment. I remembered the night before Grandpa slipped into the coma. He'd been lucid for almost 10 minutes, long enough to squeeze my hand and say, the farm stays protected, not sold, not stripped. I told him I understood. He nodded once. That was the last full sentence he ever spoke. Becca never knew about that conversation. She wasn't there. The chapel doors opened. Applause followed. Applause. For a forged will. For a woman who hadn't changed a single bandage. I felt anger rise. Not loud, not explosive. Controlled. Focused. I gave up a career most people would have killed for. I turned down promotions. I disappeared from every social circle I had. I slept in a wooden chair for months. And now I was the disgrace. The burden. The deserter. I opened my eyes and stared at the cemetery gate. She thought she'd cornered me financially, publicly, socially. But she made one mistake. She picked a date that can be verified. Medical records exist. Hospice logs, prescription timestamps, oxygen machine usage data. All of it archived. And she forgot something else. I was there. I know exactly when Grandpa lost consciousness. I know exactly how weak his grip was. I know he couldn't hold a pen steady even weeks before the coma. There was no way he signed anything 3 months before he died. No way. Rain slid down the windshield in long streaks. Inside the chapel, guests began moving toward the gravesite. I started the engine fully this time and adjusted the rearview mirror. Becca thought she had buried more than just Grandpa today. She was wrong. I pulled my phone back out and switched it to secure mode. No social apps, no regular signal, just a small encrypted program that looked like a calculator to anyone who didn't know better. I typed in a sequence that hadn't changed in years. 8 digits, pause, 3 more, then I hit send. The message wasn't words. It was a code string tied to a frequency only a handful of people monitored. If it reached the right person, I'd know. I drove away from the cemetery and parked 2 miles down the road near a maintenance building that backed up to a line of trees. No cameras, no foot traffic. Just wet asphalt and the low hum of distant traffic. My phone vibrated once. Reply received. A single line appeared on the screen. Status I typed back. Compromised publicly. Legal issue. Need verification on date stamp. Also need contact with K. 3 dots blinked for a few seconds. Then copy, stand by, Colonel. Colonel, that word would have sounded ridiculous to anyone at that funeral. To Becca, I was a dropout, a runaway, a cautionary tale. 5 years ago, my official military file stopped updating. Promotion boards showed no record. Assignment logs went blank. As far as public databases were concerned, I had stepped away from service. That was intentional. You don't put certain units on a website. You don't list certain deployments in a newsletter. You don't advertise surgeons who operate in places that technically don't exist. I wasn't a deserter. I was reassigned. Level 5 clearance. Forward Surgical Command attached to a joint task force that never used its real name. We worked in temporary structures, cargo planes, reinforced basements, once in a tunnel system carved into rock. Trauma surgery in combat isn't like the movies. There's no dramatic music, no inspirational speeches. It's blood loss calculations, it's airway control, it's deciding in under 30 seconds who gets the table and who gets morphine. I became good at that. Too good. The unit nickname started as a joke, the Ghosts, because we arrived without warning and left without documentation. My personnel file was scrubbed to protect operational integrity. That meant when Becca went looking for my service history, she found a gap. She filled it with whatever made her look better. My phone vibrated again. K is en route, 45 minutes. K. Kessler, Grandpa's attorney. I leaned back in the driver's seat and stared at the overcast sky. Grandpa knew what I did. Not details, not locations. But he knew enough. He used to ask me about the boys in that careful way he did when he wanted to show respect without prying. I never lied to him. I just didn't give him coordinates. Another message came through. General Harlan is aware. So the general had recognized the ring. Good. I looked down at my right hand. The silver band was worn smooth along the edges. No gemstone, no engraving visible from the outside. It looked like something you'd buy at a roadside shop for $20. Inside there was a small etched insignia, only visible under direct light. Each member of the unit received one after their first deployment. Not as a reward. As an identifier, a quiet way to confirm who you were when paperwork couldn't. We didn't wear patches. We didn't post photos. The ring was the only proof we existed. The Ghosts. The ones who stabilized entire platoons in blackout conditions. The ones who kept casualties alive long enough to make evacuation possible. The ones who left before the press arrived. The ring wasn't jewelry, it was clearance. 42 minutes later, a dark sedan pulled up beside my car. Kessler stepped out, umbrella in one hand, leather briefcase in the other. He was older than I remembered. More gray at the temples. Same sharp eyes. He didn't smile. He got into the passenger seat without hesitation. "I assume you heard," he said. "I heard," I replied. He set the briefcase on his lap and clicked it open. "I told your grandfather this would happen," he continued. He insisted on discretion. "Did he sign anything 3 months before he died?" I asked. Kessler didn't hesitate. No, I felt something inside me settle. Not relief, confirmation. He was medically incapacitated by then, Kessler said. "I have documentation from the hospice physician and 2 attending nurses." He pulled out a folder and handed it to me. Inside were copies of medical evaluations dated and signed. Statements confirming that Grandpa was non-responsive and legally incompetent to execute new legal documents during that period. "She forged it," I said. "Yes. No drama, no shock, just fact." Kessler reached into the briefcase again and removed a second, thicker envelope. "This," he said, placing it carefully in my hands, "is what your sister doesn't know." I opened it. Inside were transfer documents, trust agreements, banking authorizations. My name was printed across the top. Thomas Whitaker Veterans Relief Foundation. Value $18.7 million in liquid and managed assets. My breath stayed steady, but my grip tightened. "He established the foundation 2 years ago," Kessler said. "And 6 months before his passing, he transferred full operational control to you." "Why wasn't this read inside?" I asked. "Because your sister presented her version first. And I wanted to confirm you were ready before escalating." "Ready?" "I'm ready," I said. Kessler nodded. "He trusted you," he added. "Not because you were blood, because you were present." I closed the folder slowly. The farmland, the metals, the properties, they were symbols. The foundation was power. It funded housing for disabled veterans, mental health treatment, emergency grants for families who fell through bureaucratic cracks. Grandpa never cared about owning land. He cared about taking care of the men who came home broken. And he put me in charge of that mission. My phone vibrated again. General Harlan requests your presence. Of course he did. Kessler followed my gaze to the ring. He recognized it, Kessler said quietly. Yes. You were never a deserter, he added. No. Outside, the rain had eased slightly. I slid the foundation documents back into the envelope and handed Kessler the forged will copy I had photographed earlier from the chapel display screen. She used the wrong date, I said. Kessler allowed himself a thin smile. That's usually how arrogance works. I looked down at the ring one more time. Becca saw a cheap piece of silver. The general saw a clearance marker tied to operations that never made headlines. The guests saw a disgrace. In less than an hour, they were going to see something else. I stepped out of the car and walked back toward the chapel with the envelope tucked under my coat. The rain had slowed to a mist, thin enough to see clearly, but steady enough to soak through fabric if you stood still. My boots made a dull sound against the pavement. Measured, even. The main entrance was crowded. Guests were moving toward the gravesite in clusters, trading quiet comments and checking their phones. I circled around the side of the building instead. There was a service door near the back. I remembered it from when Grandpa insisted on pre-planning every detail of his funeral. He said he didn't trust anyone else to get it right. The door wasn't locked. Inside, the air smelled like polished wood and damp coats. Becca's voice, carried from the front of the chapel, amplified through overhead speakers. My grandfather believed in strength, she was saying. In showing up, in loyalty. I paused just inside the doorway. The casket sat at the front flag, tight and bright against the muted room. The honor guard stood at attention. General Harlan was seated to the left posture. Straight eyes forward. Becca stood at the podium, one hand resting lightly on the edge, as if she were presenting quarterly earnings instead of delivering a eulogy. He taught me discipline, she continued. He taught me what it means to carry a legacy. Her tone was steady, controlled. She had practiced this. I moved along the back wall and slipped into the last row. No one noticed at first. Most of the guests were focused on her. And he taught me something else, she said, letting her voice dip just slightly. That courage means staying, even when things get hard. A few heads nodded. She took a small breath. Not everyone understands that, she added. There it was. I could feel several people glance around subtly, as if expecting me to materialize, just to confirm the accusation. I know some of you are aware, Becca went on, that my sister chose to distance herself from this family years ago. Grandpa felt that deeply. She lowered her eyes, performing restraint. But he also believed that character reveals itself in absence. Murmurs. Two men in the second row leaned toward each other. I recognized them from one of Becca's real estate events years back. Investors. One of them shook his head slightly. Shame, I heard him whisper. Shame. The word traveled fast in rooms like this. She walked away from responsibility, Becca said clearly now. And in many ways, that was her final act of cowardice. Cowardice. My pulse didn't change. I watched her carefully, the way she held eye contact with certain guests. The way she paused just long enough for her words to land. This wasn't grief. It was branding. She shifted topics smoothly. As the sole heir to my grandfather's estate, she continued, I promise to honor his legacy by expanding our family's business footprint and preserving the Whitaker name. There were a few polite claps, wrong moment, wrong tone, but no one corrected it. She had turned a funeral into a shareholder meeting. General Harlan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Becca looked around the room. Legacy is about strength, she repeated. And not everyone is built to carry it. That was my cue. I stood. The movement was small, but it drew attention. A few heads turned, then more. Becca's eyes found me almost instantly. For a split second, something flickered there. Surprise. Then irritation. I didn't rush. I didn't speak. I walked down the side aisle and sat in the very last seat, hands folded loosely in my lap. Wet coat, plain clothes, no diamonds. The room went quiet. Becca's grip tightened on the podium. I'm sorry, she said into the microphone, forcing a thin smile. It seems we have an uninvited guest. Uninvited. A few guests twisted in their seats to get a better look at me. I met their eyes one by one. Calm, neutral. This ceremony is for family and close associates, Becca continued. Security. The two guards from the gate appeared almost immediately near the side entrance. Becca didn't lower her voice this time. "Please remove her," she said. "We're trying to maintain a respectful atmosphere." Respectful. One of the guards approached down the aisle. His shoes tapped against the wooden floor in slow, deliberate steps. "You need to leave," he said quietly when he reached me. "I'm seated," I replied. "You're not authorized to be here." "Authorized." I glanced toward the front of the room. General Harlan was no longer looking at the casket. He was looking at me, specifically at my right hand resting against my knee. The guard reached for my arm again. His fingers pressed into the fabric of my coat. Before he could apply force, Becca spoke louder. "She has no place here," she declared. "She abandoned her duty to this family. The least she can do now is stay away." Abandoned. I stood slowly, not in resistance, not in surrender, just steady. "You're disrupting a sacred moment," she added. The word sacred sounded rehearsed. I could feel every set of eyes in the room on me. Investors, politicians, veterans, staff. I didn't defend myself. I didn't argue. I didn't remind anyone of hospital nights or oxygen levels. I simply adjusted my coat and looked at Becca. The silence stretched. One of her business partners leaned toward another and whispered, "I thought she was gone for good." "She should have stayed gone," the other replied. Becca straightened, sensing control returning. "This is exactly what Grandpa warned me about," she said into the microphone. "People who run from responsibility eventually show up only when there's something to gain." There it was again. The money, the estate, the narrative. The guard tightened his grip slightly. "Ma'am," he said more firmly now. I let my right hand shift just enough for the overhead light to catch the silver ring. A small reflection. Brief. General Harlan stood. The movement was immediate and unmistakable. Chairs creaked as several guests turned toward him. Becca faltered for half a second, then tried to continue. "As I was saying, stand down," General Harlan said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The guard froze. Becca blinked. "I'm sorry," she said. The general stepped into the aisle. "I said stand down," he repeated. Eyes still on me. The room felt tighter now, air heavier. Conversations dead. Becca forced a laugh. "General, with all due respect, this is a private family matter." He didn't look at her. He walked slowly down the aisle until he was standing 3 rows in front of me. His gaze dropped once more to the ring. Recognition, confirmation, and something else. Shock. The guard released my arm. Becca's composure thinned at the edges. "This woman is not welcome here," she insisted. "She's already embarrassed us enough." I remained silent, still, waiting. The guard's hand tightened on my shoulder, and then the sound hit. Boots, heavy, synchronized, striking pavement outside the chapel in perfect cadence. Left, right, left, right. It wasn't random movement. It wasn't confused foot traffic. It was formation. Every head in the room turned toward the entrance. The doors at the back opened in unison. Cold air rushed in carrying the smell of rain and polished leather. 21 soldiers stepped inside. Dress blues, medals aligned, white gloves, caps low and exact. Their movements were sharp, controlled, rehearsed down to the inch. Water still clung to their shoulders from the rain, but none of them brushed it off. The sound of their boots on the chapel floor was deliberate, even. Echoing against the wooden walls, the guard's hand dropped from my shoulder without being told. Becca froze at the podium. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice thinner now. No one answered her. The soldiers split cleanly into 2 lines down the center aisle, forming a corridor from the entrance to the front of the room. Their posture didn't shift. Their eyes stayed forward. At the doorway, another figure stepped in. 4 stars, full dress uniform. General Harlan had been inside the chapel moments ago. The man entering now wore the same rank, but this was a different presence. Older, taller. The kind of authority that didn't need introduction. Conversations died completely. The general at the front of the room turned sharply and stood at attention. Every soldier inside the chapel snapped into a sharper stance. Becca looked from one face to another, searching for someone to reassure her. No one moved. The 4-star general walked down the aisle. He didn't glance at Becca. Didn't acknowledge the guests. Didn't even look at the casket. He walked straight toward me. Each step was measured. Exact. The sound of his shoes striking the floor carried through the silence. When he reached me, he stopped. He looked down at my right hand. The ring caught the light again. Recognition locked in. The room held its breath. Then he stepped back 1 pace, came to full attention, and rendered a salute. Not casual, not polite. formal, precise. The highest military courtesy given from one officer to another, every soldier lining the aisle followed. 21 salutes snapped up in perfect unison. The sound of fabric and gloves moving was sharp and final. Becca stared. "What is happening?" she said, her voice cracking slightly. No one answered her. I stood slowly. I returned the salute. Clean, exact, equal. The general lowered his hand first. The soldiers followed. He spoke clearly, projecting just enough to reach every corner of the chapel. "Colonel Whitaker," he said. A ripple moved through the room. "Colonel, not deserter, not runaway, Colonel," Becca shook her head. "That's not possible." The general continued as if she hadn't spoken. "We apologize for the delay," he said. "Operational clearance required confirmation." The words were controlled, technical, undeniable. Becca stepped down from the podium, heels clicking too fast against the wood. "There must be some mistake," she said, forcing a brittle laugh. "My sister left the service years ago." The general's gaze shifted to her for the first time. "There is no mistake," he replied. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. One of the investors in the second row whispered, "Colonel," another muttered, "I thought she quit." I could feel the weight of every eye on me now. The general reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document sealed with an official insignia. He didn't hand it to Becca. He handed it to me. "Your active commission remains classified," he said quietly, but audibly enough. "However, your authority is recognized." "Authority," Becca's posture faltered. "This is absurd," she snapped. "She hasn't been on any public record. We checked." "Yes," the general replied evenly. "That was intentional." A few of the guests shifted uncomfortably. The narrative they had accepted minutes ago was collapsing. The general stepped aside slightly, clearing the line of sight between me and the soldiers. "All units present are here to honor Sergeant Major Thomas Whitaker," he said, "and to acknowledge the officer he trusted most." Trusted. The word landed harder than anything else that morning. Becca's face drained of color. "You're disrupting a funeral," she tried again. "No," the general said. "We're restoring it." He turned back to me. His voice dropped a fraction. "Colonel, we are prepared to proceed with full military honors." I nodded once. The soldiers pivoted in place, boots striking in perfect sync. Outside, another sound began. Rifles being positioned. Becca looked toward the windows, panic creeping into her expression. "This is my family's ceremony," she insisted, though the confidence was gone. "I am the sole heir." Several guests avoided her eyes now. The general didn't argue. He simply gave a small signal with his hand. The chapel doors opened wider. Outside, the honor detail formed up across the wet grass. 21 rifles lifted. The first volley fired. The sound cracked through the air, sharp and echoing, rolling over the cemetery in a clean wave. Some guests flinched. Others straightened instinctively. The second volley followed, then the third. 21 shots. Measured, respectful, final. Inside the chapel, silence pressed against the walls. No one whispered now. No one checked their phones. The narrative had shifted. Becca stood near the podium, hands clenched at her sides. "This doesn't change anything," she said, but it sounded like she was convincing herself. The general stepped closer to me. "Colonel," he said clearly, ensuring the entire room could hear, "we are ready to execute the final honors for the greatest soldier among us." The words settled into the air like weight. Greatest soldier, not for rank, not for publicity, for service. Becca's breathing was visible now in the tight rise and fall of her shoulders. Investors who had applauded her minutes earlier stared at me with a different kind of calculation. The soldiers lining the aisle did not move. They didn't look at Becca. They didn't look at the guests. They looked straight ahead, waiting for my command. I stepped forward. The wooden floor felt solid under my boots. Every sound in the room had sharpened. Fabric shifting, someone swallowing too hard. The faint hum of the ventilation system overhead. General Harlan moved with me toward the podium. Becca stood frozen beside it, fingers still curled tight. For the first time in her life, she didn't look prepared. The general faced the room. "Before we conclude these honors," he said, voice steady and precise, "there is a matter of record that requires correction." Correction, he removed a thin folder from inside his jacket. "This ceremony has included public statements questioning Colonel Sarah Whitaker's service and character." No one breathed. He opened the folder. "Colonel Whitaker did not abandon her commission," he continued. 5 years ago, she was reassigned under classified authority to a Joint Special Operations Medical Unit." Murmurs broke out. Quick, confused. Becca shook her head. This is ridiculous. The general did not acknowledge her. Her personnel file was intentionally removed from standard databases for operational security, he said. During that time, she served as lead trauma surgeon for a forward surgical detachment attached to naval and ground strike groups in active theaters. He paused. In one operation alone, she and her team stabilized and evacuated every critical casualty from a carrier strike group under sustained attack. The room went still again. Carrier strike group. That wasn't small. That wasn't symbolic. That was thousands of lives depending on rapid medical response. The operation remains classified, the general said. It will not appear in public records. It will not be written about. But it happened. He closed the folder, and she was there. A veteran in the third row slowly straightened his posture. One of Becca's investors lowered his gaze. Becca tried again. Anyone can say anything without proof. The general looked at her now finally. I do not make statements without proof. He turned back to the room. Colonel Whitaker has received multiple commendations that cannot be publicly displayed due to classification restrictions. However, I can state this clearly. She has saved more American lives in the past 5 years than most officers will in a lifetime. Silence, not stunned, not confused, respectful. I felt every eye on me again, but it felt different now, heavier, real. The general stepped slightly aside. Colonel, he said quietly to me. The floor is yours. I walked to the podium. No rush, no drama. Becca stepped back instinctively. Up close, I could see the thin crack in her composure, the way her mascara had smudged just slightly at the edge, the tightness in her jaw. I didn't look at her. I looked at the casket, then at the room. My grandfather didn't care about titles, I said. My voice carried evenly through the microphone. No shake, no anger. He cared about showing up. I let that settle. I showed up, short, direct. No speech about sacrifice. No list of missions. I didn't disappear. I continued. I was reassigned. And I stayed quiet because that's what the job required. A few guests nodded slowly. I also stayed quiet when he got sick, I added. I moved into his farmhouse. I managed his medications. I tracked his oxygen levels. I was there the night he stopped speaking. I reached into my coat and pulled out the hospice log copies Kessler had given me. These are medical records confirming that 3 months before his passing, he was in a full coma, non-responsive, legally incapacitated. I placed the documents on the podium. The will that was read earlier today was dated during that period. The shift in the room was immediate. Becca's face hardened. You're accusing me of something criminal at a funeral, she snapped. Yes, I said, no hesitation. I am. A few gasps broke out. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I also have this. I tapped the screen and pressed play. The recording wasn't long. 47 seconds. Becca's voice filled the chapel. You're not going to remember this anyway, she said softly in the audio. Just sign it, Grandpa. It's paperwork. I'll handle everything. A faint sound of labored breathing followed. Then her voice again sharper. You always trusted me more. The recording ended. The room felt smaller. Becca's mouth opened but no sound came out. That was recorded in his bedroom, I said. The same week the forged document was dated. General Harlan didn't move. He didn't need to. The soldiers lining the aisle stood like a wall. Becca finally found her voice. You recorded me. That's illegal. It's evidence, I replied. Her composure cracked fully now. You think this makes you better than me, she demanded. You left. You always leave. I stepped away from the podium. No, I said calmly. I stay where I'm needed. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. I picked up the second envelope and held it up. This is the actual transfer your grandfather executed 6 months before he died, I said. He placed the Thomas Whitaker Veterans Relief Foundation under my operational control. I handed it to General Harlan. He scanned the first page briefly. Verified, he said. $18 million. Allocated to housing, medical treatment, and mental health support for veterans who fell through administrative cracks. Grandpa's real legacy. Not land, not headlines, service. I turned back to the room. I didn't want to fight, I said. I wanted to sit in the back and say goodbye. That part was true. But you don't get to rewrite who I am, I added, looking directly at Becca now. She looked smaller. Not physically, structurally, like something holding her up had just been removed. You called me a coward, I continued. You called me a burden. I let my hand rest briefly on the ring. I've spent 5 years operating in blackout conditions to keep soldiers breathing long enough to see their families again. I don't need applause. I don't need recognition. I straightened fully. But I will not let you steal from a dying man and call it legacy. The room was completely silent. No whispers, no phones, just the sound of rain against stained glass. For the first time since this morning began, I wasn't reacting. I was deciding, and everyone in that chapel could feel it. Becca let out a sharp laugh. It was too loud for the room, too forced. "This is insane," she said, stepping forward again. "You coordinated this. The soldiers, the speech, the fake recording. You've been planning this ambush." No one moved. The 21 soldiers lining the aisle didn't shift their weight, didn't blink. Their presence alone changed the air pressure in the room. "You think flashing a uniform makes you untouchable?" she continued, pointing at me now. "You disappeared for 5 years and suddenly you come back with theatrics." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. General Harlan remained still beside me, hands folded behind his back. Becca turned to the room. "Are we really going to let her hijack this funeral?" she demanded. "She's trying to steal everything." Steal. That word didn't land the way she wanted. One of the investors in the second row stood up slowly. "Rebecca," he said carefully, "is that recording authentic?" Her head snapped toward him. "Of course not, it's manipulated." Another man stood. This one older. White hair, he had been nodding during her speech earlier. "We conducted preliminary due diligence before entering negotiations with you," he said. "You claimed uncontested inheritance of the Whitaker farmland." "I do," she shot back. He looked toward General Harlan, then at the hospice document still resting on the podium. "Forgery voids contracts," he said flatly. A woman near the aisle closed her leather portfolio and snapped it shut. "We cannot move forward under legal uncertainty," she added. "Our board will not tolerate exposure to fraud." Fraud. The word echoed more clearly than Coward ever had. Becca's posture stiffened. "You're overreacting," she said quickly. "This is a family dispute." "No," the older investor replied. "It's a criminal allegation." 2 more guests stood up, quietly, without ceremony. "I'm suspending our agreement effective immediately," one said. "We're pulling out as well," another added. The ripple effect was immediate. Phones came out, assistants were texted, contracts mentally shredded in real time. The empire Becca had built in the last 3 years depended on perception. Strong heir, clean inheritance, military family credibility, that foundation just cracked. She looked at me like she could still win this by volume. "You think they care about you?" she hissed. "They care about money." "I know," I said. That was the problem for her. General Harlan stepped forward slightly. At this time, he said calmly, "Military investigators have also completed a preliminary audit." Becca blinked. "What audit?" The chapel doors opened again. This time, it wasn't ceremonial. 2 military police officers entered in formal dress uniform. Behind them, a civilian investigator in a dark suit. No rush, no raised voices. One of the MPs held a folder. "Rebecca Whitaker," he said. Her chin lifted. "Yes." He opened the folder. "You are being formally notified of an active investigation into financial misconduct involving the unauthorized diversion of funds from veteran support initiatives tied to the Whitaker estate." Her face strained. "That's absurd," she said. "I never had access to—" The investigator interrupted. "Wire transfers totaling $3.2 million were routed through Shell development accounts under your authorization," he said evenly. "Those accounts were presented publicly as transitional housing projects for disabled veterans." The silence in the room sharpened. Housing projects. She had used the language of service and siphoned the money. "That's business restructuring," she snapped. "You don't understand corporate flow." "We understand misappropriation," the investigator replied. One of the MPs stepped closer. "You are also under review for forgery and elder exploitation." Becca's composure shattered fully now. "This is her doing," she said, pointing at me again. "She's jealous. She's been jealous her entire life." The soldiers didn't react. General Harlan didn't blink. I stepped forward 1 pace. "This isn't jealousy," I said quietly. "It's math." She stared at me. "You always thought I was naive," I continued, "that I didn't understand business." Her breathing was uneven now. "You don't," she snapped. I reached into my coat one last time. "I understand ownership," I said. I removed a thin black card and handed it to the civilian investigator. He scanned it, his eyebrows lifted slightly. He looked at me again, then back at the card. Is this accurate? He asked. Yes. He turned toward Becca. For your awareness, he said carefully. The development firm you've been negotiating with for the Whitaker farmland acquisition is majority owned by a holding company, under Colonel Whitaker's control. The words settled slowly. Becca blinked. What I met her eyes. You've been pitching to me for 6 months, I said. Silence. You never knew because the ownership structure isn't public-facing, I continued. We evaluate land use proposals carefully, especially when they involve veteran housing. Her mouth opened, closed. You, she started. Yes, I said. The firm she had been trying to impress. The investors she paraded around. The expansion plans she built her public image on. I owned controlling interest. Through the foundation. Through Grandpa's trust. Through legal transfers she never bothered to investigate because she assumed I had nothing. One of the investors let out a low whistle. So she was negotiating against herself, he muttered. The MPs stepped closer to Becca. Rebecca Whitaker once said firmly, You are required to accompany us. She backed up a step. You can't arrest me at my grandfather's funeral. We are not arresting you at this moment, the investigator replied. We are formally detaining you pending charges. Detaining, not dramatic, not theatrical, final. Becca looked around the room, searching for support. No one moved to help her. Not the investors, not the guests, not even the security guards she hired. The soldiers still lined the aisle, silent, solid. She looked at me one last time. This isn't over, she said, but it sounded smaller now. It is, I replied. The MPS guided her toward the doors. Her heels clicked unevenly against the floor. The doors opened. Cold air rushed in again. And then she was gone. The chapel stayed quiet. No applause. No gasps, just the sound of rain outside and 21 soldiers standing in perfect formation. Her empire hadn't exploded. It had folded in on itself, quietly, precisely, the way real collapses happen. I stepped outside after the final salute faded. The cemetery felt different now, quieter, heavier in a way that had nothing to do with the rain. Most of the guests had already left. Black SUVs pulled away one by one, tires hissing on wet pavement. The honor guard was folding the flag with precise movements, crisp corners, tight lines, no wasted motion. 21 soldiers stood at a respectful distance. Near the far edge of the walkway, under a tall oak tree, Becca stood between 2 military police officers. Her wrists were cuffed in front of her, not violently, not dramatically, just secure. Her hair was no longer perfect. Strands clung to her cheeks from the mist. Her makeup had streaked slightly. She looked smaller without a podium and an audience. I walked toward her. The MPs glanced at me. 2 minutes, I said. They exchanged a look, then stepped back a few feet. Close enough to intervene, far enough to let us speak. Becca didn't meet my eyes at first. She stared at the ground. Then her shoulders began to shake. I can't believe you did this, she said, voice breaking. I stood in front of her, hands at my sides. I didn't forge a will, I replied. She looked up sharply. You humiliated me. You humiliated yourself. Her jaw tightened, then loosened again. You always had to be the hero, she snapped. Even as a kid. I didn't respond. Rain tapped softly against the leaves above us. I worked for everything, she continued, words spilling out now. Every contact. Every investor. Every deal. Do you know how hard it is to be taken seriously in that world? Yes, I said. She hesitated. I had to prove I was strong, she said. I had to show them I could handle the estate, the land, the foundation. You didn't need to steal to prove that. Her eyes flashed. You don't understand pressure, she said. You disappear into classified missions and come back with medals no one can even see. I had to build something real. I let that sit for a moment. Real doesn't mean honest, I said. Her breathing quickened again. It started small, she admitted. Reallocating funds, temporary transfers. I was going to put it back. How much, I asked. She swallowed. 3 million, she said quietly. The number hung in the air. That money was meant for veterans who can't afford prosthetics, I said. For families who can't pay rent after medical discharge. I was under pressure, she said again. Do you know how many people expected me to succeed after you left? There it was. After you left. I didn't leave, I said evenly. You vanished, she shot back. You were gone. No calls, no holidays. Grandpa defended you every time I asked." She looked down at her cuffed hands. "I was the one who stayed visible," she said. "I had to hold everything together." "You stayed visible," I repeated. "That's not the same as staying present." She flinched slightly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The wind shifted. The flag over Grandpa's casket rustled softly as it was carried toward me. Becca's voice dropped. "I didn't think he would die that fast," she whispered. "I thought I had more time to do what I asked, to fix it." I studied her face, not the anger, not the pride, the fear. "You told him to sign papers while he couldn't breathe," I said quietly. Her eyes filled again. "I just needed control," she said, "for once. I needed something to be mine." I thought about the farmhouse, the nights he coughed until his chest shook, the way he squeezed my hand when the pain spiked. He never asked for control, he asked for company. Becca's shoulders slumped. "I'm going to lose everything," she said. "You already did," I replied. She looked up at me, desperate now. "You could stop this," she said. "You could tell them it was a misunderstanding. You could say the recording was taken out of context." "No," I said. Tears slid down her face. "I'm your sister, yes," I said. The word didn't carry warmth. It carried history. "You're really going to let them take me away?" she asked. "I'm not letting anyone do anything," I said. "You made choices." She shook her head weakly. "You always act like you're better." "I don't," I said. "I just know the difference between pressure and integrity." Her breathing slowed slightly. "You think Grandpa would want this?" she asked. I looked past her toward the rows of white headstones stretching across the hill. "He told me something the night before he stopped speaking," I said. She waited. "Sức mạnh không nằm ở cấp bậc trên vai," I said, slowly translating in my head, the way he had once explained it to me in his own words. "Strength isn't about the rank on your shoulder." Her eyes stayed locked on mine. "It's about whether you stand your ground when everyone else runs." I let the silence stretch. "You ran," I said. "You ran from honesty. You ran from responsibility. You ran from him when he needed you." Her face crumpled. "And you ran from this family," she whispered. "I ran toward something bigger," I replied. "You ran away from something smaller." The MPS shifted slightly, signaling time. Becca's voice dropped to a whisper. "I didn't want to be the weak one." "You weren't," I said. "You chose to be." That landed, not loud, not dramatic, just true. She closed her eyes. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I know," I said. For a second I saw the version of her from years ago, before investors, before headlines, before ambition sharpened into hunger. But that version had been buried under choices. "I won't fight the charges," she said quietly. "That's your decision." The MPS stepped forward gently. "It's time," one said. Becca looked at me one last time. "I thought success meant winning," she said. "It means standing still when you're tempted to run," I replied. They guided her toward the waiting vehicle. She didn't resist. The door closed. The engine started. I stood there as the car pulled away down the wet road. Justice doesn't feel loud. It doesn't feel victorious. It feels steady, clean, and a little heavier than you expect. The rain had stopped completely now. I turned back toward Grandpa's grave. The air smelled like damp earth and folded fabric. The soldiers were waiting, and for the first time all morning there was nothing left to fight. I stepped toward the casket as the honor guard positioned the flag. 21 soldiers stood in formation behind me, still, silent. Every uniform sharp despite the rain. The air had cleared. The sky was still gray but lighter now. General Harlan handed me the folded edge of the flag. His eyes held mine for a brief second. "Colonel," he said quietly. I nodded. We began the folding process together. Precise movements, corner to corner, tight and clean, no hesitation. The fabric felt heavier than it looked. Cold from the morning air, each fold carried weight. Grandpa taught me how to do this when I was 16. He said if you're going to wear the uniform, you should know how to honor it. He made me practice until the edges lined up perfectly. No shortcuts, he'd said. I didn't take any now. The soldiers watched without shifting. When the final triangle was formed, I held the folded flag in both hands. It was solid, compact, final. General Harlan stepped back, allowing space. I walked to the head of the grave. The earth was fresh, dark, cleanly cut. The headstone temporary for now. The permanent one would come later. I knelt carefully, the damp grass soaking through my pants, and placed the folded flag against the casket before it was lowered. "For your service," I said quietly. Not a speech, just fact. When I stood, the soldiers saluted one last time. I returned it. Then they broke formation one by one, stepping away in controlled silence. No applause, no cameras, just closure. Kessler approached from a short distance away, briefcase in hand. "It's done," he asked. "It's done," I replied. He opened the briefcase. "The estate paperwork can be finalized within the week," he said. "The farmland properties investments. It's all legally yours pending formal processing." I looked out over the cemetery rows stretching into the distance. "Transfer it," I said. He paused. "Transfer all non-restricted assets." I clarified. "Liquidate the development holdings. Preserve the land under conservation status. Redirect proceeds to the foundation." He studied me for a moment. "That's a significant amount of money," he said. "I know, you don't want to retain anything personally." I looked down at my right hand. The silver ring caught the light again. "I already have what matters," I said. Kessler nodded slowly. "I'll initiate the transfer," he replied. "Set up independent oversight," I added. "Third-party audits every quarter, full transparency." He gave a small approving nod. "Your grandfather would respect that, I know." When he walked away, I stayed standing by the grave. The farmland would never become luxury housing. The investment accounts would never pad anyone's ego. The foundation would expand. Real housing, real treatment programs, real impact. Not press releases, not galas, results. The wind picked up slightly, moving through the rows of headstones. I thought about Becca sitting in the back of a vehicle with metal around her wrists. I didn't feel triumph. I felt clarity. Family isn't automatic. It's not guaranteed by last names or shared DNA. It's proven under pressure. I crouched again and pressed my palm lightly against the damp soil. "Jiadin kung filangui ka tension jaito," I said quietly, hearing Grandpa's voice in my head. Family isn't the people whose names are written on documents. It's the ones who stand next to you when the dark hits. The soldiers had stood. Grandpa had stood. I had stood. Becca had run. I stood up straight and brushed the dirt from my hands. "Don't ever confuse a soldier's silence with weakness," I said under my breath. Silence isn't absence. It's discipline. It's restraint. It's control when everyone else loses theirs. I turned and walked toward the path leading out of the cemetery. No reporters waited. No one stopped me. The morning felt ordinary again. My phone buzzed once. A message from the foundation's interim board. Funds secured. Ready for expansion planning. Good. There was work to do. Real work. Not image management. Not damage control. Service. I glanced once more at the ring on my finger. The ghosts didn't look for recognition. They didn't need headlines. They did the job and moved on. That's what I would do now. I reached the gate. The same iron bars that had slammed shut earlier stood open. No one blocked my path. No one questioned my presence. I stepped through without slowing down. Before I end this, I want to ask you something. If you had to choose between keeping money that wasn't earned and protecting your integrity when no one is watching, what would you choose? If you believe honesty matters more than inheritance, more than status, more than appearance, then subscribe and share your story. Let's honor the quiet people who stand their ground when it would be easier to run. The real test wasn't the funeral. It wasn't the soldiers. It wasn't the arrest. It wasn't the public humiliation. The real test happened later. It happened in a quiet office with clean paperwork and numbers that could have changed my life overnight. No cameras, no witnesses, no applause. Just a decision. Integrity sounds noble when you say it out loud. It sounds powerful in speeches. It sounds heroic in movies. In real life, integrity is expensive. It costs you first. When I transferred the estate assets into the foundation, no one forced me. Legally, I could have kept a large portion. The farmland alone would have set me up for life. The development rights were worth millions. No one would have blamed me for taking my share. After everything that happened, I could have justified it. I didn't. Not because I'm morally superior. Because I've seen what happens when people choose convenience over character. It starts small. One shortcut. One temporary adjustment. One signature when no one's paying attention. That's how Becca justified it. It was just restructuring. Just leverage, just pressure. Integrity doesn't collapse in one dramatic moment. It erodes, slowly, under pressure. And pressure is real. If you've ever worked in corporate America, you know what I mean. Targets, deadlines, expectations. A boss who says just make it work. A client who hints that bending the numbers would help everyone. You tell yourself it's temporary. You tell yourself everyone does it. You tell yourself you'll fix it later. That's the fork in the road. Integrity rarely feels rewarding in the moment. It feels inconvenient. It feels isolating. It sometimes makes you look difficult. When I refused to validate the forged will quietly and handle it as a family matter, I knew it would explode publicly. I knew people would talk. I knew it would get messy. Silence would have been easier, but silence isn't always strength. And here's something most people misunderstand. Silence can be discipline, or it can be avoidance. For 5 years, I stayed silent about my service. That silence had purpose. It protected lives. It protected operations. It wasn't fear. Becca's silence around the diverted funds was different. That silence protected ego. You have to know which one you're practicing. If you're quiet because you're calculating impact, that's strength. If you're quiet because you're afraid of consequences, that's avoidance. There's a difference. Another thing I learned: integrity won't always make you liked. In fact, it often does the opposite. When you refuse to participate in something unethical, you become inconvenient to people who benefit from it. You'll hear phrases like, "Don't be dramatic. It's not a big deal. You're overthinking this." That's pressure talking. Integrity isn't about being the loudest person in the room. It's about being the most stable when the room shifts. At that funeral, I didn't win because I raised my voice. I won because I didn't. Control under pressure is power. If you lose your temper, you lose leverage. If you shout, you give your opponent something to point at. Calm is unsettling to people who rely on chaos. That's true in business. It's true in family. It's true in negotiations. When Becca accused me of staging everything, I didn't argue point by point. I presented facts, dates, documents, audio. Facts don't need volume. If someone is attacking your character, don't match their emotion. Match them with evidence. And if you don't have evidence yet, build it. Here's practical advice. In your career, document everything. Save emails. Keep records. Don't rely on memory in high-stakes environments. In your finances, understand what you sign. If something feels rushed, it probably is. In your relationships, pay attention to patterns, not apologies. Pressure reveals character. It doesn't create it. When money entered the picture, Becca didn't transform into someone corrupt. She amplified what was already there. Money is a magnifier, so is power. If you ever find yourself stepping into more authority, whether that's running a business, inheriting assets, or leading a team, ask yourself one question. What part of me will this magnify? If the answer makes you uncomfortable, fix it before you grow. Another lesson. Don't confuse short-term advantage with long-term security. Becca gained $3 million temporarily. She lost her credibility permanently. Credibility is hard to earn and easy to destroy. Once people question your integrity, every future move is filtered through doubt, and rebuilding trust takes longer than building wealth. If I had quietly split the estate and walked away, I would have protected peace in the short term, but I would have compromised the foundation's mission, and I would have compromised myself. There's a phrase Grandpa used to repeat. Your name walks into rooms before you do. That's real. Your reputation arrives first. The question is, what does it say? Does it say reliable? Does it say honest? Or does it say convenient when pressured? The hardest decisions you'll ever make won't be public. They'll happen alone, at your desk, in your car, late at night. That's where integrity lives, not in speeches, in choices. And here's something else no one tells you. Integrity feels lonely sometimes. You might lose people. You might lose opportunities. You might lose invitations. But you gain something that doesn't fluctuate with markets or opinions. Stability. I can walk into any room now, corporate, military, private, and know exactly where I stand. No backtracking. No hidden liabilities. No quiet fear that something will surface later. That kind of peace is worth more than any inheritance. So let me leave you with this. The next time you're under pressure, real pressure, pause. Ask yourself, if no one ever found out about this decision, would I still be proud of it? If the answer is no, don't do it. Because eventually pressure ends, consequences don't. Integrity isn't dramatic, it's disciplined, it's consistent, and it's built when no one is watching. I didn't feel victory when the car took Becca away. I felt a line being drawn. There's something people don't like to admit. We're taught from childhood that family is automatic, permanent, untouchable. You forgive because you share blood. You tolerate because you share history. But blood doesn't guarantee loyalty. It guarantees biology. Those are not the same thing. Standing in that cemetery, watching my sisters disappear down the road in the back of a patrol vehicle, I realized something I should have understood years ago. Family is behavior, not last names, not DNA, behavior. Grandpa was family because he showed up, not because we shared a name. He showed up when I struggled. He showed up when I made hard choices. He showed up when he was dying and still tried to protect people around him from feeling like a burden. The soldiers who stood behind me that morning, they were family in that moment. Not because of blood, because of shared values, shared responsibility, shared commitment. Becca and I share blood, but when pressure hit, she protected image over integrity. She chose control over honesty. She chose reputation over relationship. And that's where the line forms. Here's something I've learned the hard way. You can love someone and still refuse to enable them. That's not cruelty, that's clarity. A lot of people stay stuck in destructive family dynamics because they confuse boundaries with betrayal. They think saying no means they're heartless. It doesn't. It means you understand consequences. When Becca asked me to fix it for her, I could have stepped in. I could have downplayed the evidence. I could have negotiated something behind closed doors. I didn't. Not because I hate her, but because protecting someone from consequences often protects their behavior. If you constantly absorb the fallout for someone else's choices, you teach them that fallout doesn't matter. That's not love. That's maintenance of dysfunction. And dysfunction spreads. If you have a family member who constantly borrows money and never repays it, you're not helping them by continuing to fund it. You're financing their irresponsibility. If you have a relative who manipulates you emotionally, guilt, shame, pressure, you're not honoring family by submitting to it. You're teaching them that tactics work. Boundaries are not punishments. They're filters. They determine what behavior you will allow near your life. One of the biggest myths I see is this. If I set boundaries, I'll lose my family. Maybe. But if the relationship only survives without boundaries, it wasn't stable to begin with. Healthy relationships adjust. Unhealthy ones resist. When I stopped covering for Becca's subtle manipulations years ago, our conversations became tense, short, uncomfortable. That tension wasn't new. It was exposed. Boundaries reveal reality. They don't create it. Another hard truth: you don't owe someone unlimited access to you just because you grew up in the same house. Access is earned by behavior. Trust is maintained by consistency. Blood doesn't override that. There's also a difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. You can forgive someone internally. You can release anger. You can stop replaying the damage in your head. That does not mean you reinsert them into your life at the same level of access. Forgiveness is internal. Reconciliation requires change. Becca crying under that oak tree didn't equal accountability. It was fear. It was collapse. It was the sudden loss of control. Real accountability shows up in action over time, not in tears under pressure. And here's the part people struggle with most. You will feel guilt when you draw boundaries, even when you're right, especially when you're right. Because you've been conditioned to equate compliance with kindness. But kindness without structure becomes self-sacrifice. And self-sacrifice without purpose becomes resentment. Resentment is slow poison in families. It builds quietly, it surfaces sideways, it destroys trust from underneath. If you constantly compromise your values to keep the peace, you're not keeping peace. You're delaying conflict. Peace built on silence isn't peace. It's avoidance. Grandpa understood that. He never yelled. He never dramatized, but he was firm, clear, direct. If he said no, it meant no, not maybe later, not convince me, no. Strength isn't loud, it's consistent. If you're trying to apply this to your own life, start simple. Be clear in your language. Don't over-explain. Don't negotiate your boundaries in circles. If someone crosses a line, address it early, calmly, directly. If they repeat it, adjust access. Less information. Less involvement, less exposure. Boundaries are not emotional outbursts. They're structural decisions. And here's something important. When you stop tolerating unhealthy behavior, some people will accuse you of changing. They're right, you are. Growth feels like rejection to people who benefited from your compliance. That's not your responsibility. Another thing, Family loyalty does not mean protecting secrets that harm others. If a family member commits fraud, abuse, or manipulation, covering it up doesn't make you honorable. It makes you complicit. There's a difference between privacy and concealment. Privacy protects dignity, concealment protects damage. Know which one you're participating in. After everything that happened, I don't hate my sister. I don't wake up angry. But I also don't pretend that blood alone repairs trust. She will face legal consequences. If she chooses accountability long-term, that's her path. But my responsibility is not to rescue her from the consequences of her own decisions. My responsibility is to protect what's right. Family is not the people who demand your silence. Family is the people who respect your standards. Family is the ones who show up when there's nothing to gain. If you're listening to this and struggling with boundaries inside your own family, here's the question to ask yourself. Are you maintaining connection out of love or out of fear? Fear of conflict, fear of rejection, fear of being labeled the difficult one. If your connection requires you to shrink your values, that's not connection. That's compromise of identity. You can love someone, you can wish them well, and you can still say, "This is as far as you go in my life." That's not cold, that's adult. Blood creates relatives. Behavior creates family. Know the difference. And don't be afraid to draw the line when you need to. A week after the funeral, I stood in a small office that used to belong to my grandfather. Same oak desk, same worn leather chair, same framed photo of him in uniform sitting crooked on the wall because he never cared enough to straighten it. The difference was the stack of files in front of me. Grant approvals, housing applications, medical subsidy requests, letters from veterans who didn't know where else to turn. $18 million sounds big when you say it out loud. It sounds powerful, it sounds like freedom, but money by itself doesn't mean anything. Money is just stored choice. What matters is what you choose to do with it. A lot of people think legacy is about accumulation, bigger house, bigger business, bigger footprint. But I've watched enough people die to know something most don't talk about. When someone is at the end, they don't ask about square footage. They ask about people. They ask if they mattered. They ask if what they built will last. My grandfather didn't care if his name stayed on the land forever. He cared that veterans who came home broken didn't get ignored. He cared that widows didn't lose their houses because paperwork got delayed. He cared about impact. Impact is the only thing that survives you. Wealth reveals character. It doesn't create it. When money entered the picture, Becca saw control, status, leverage. When money entered the picture, Grandpa saw responsibility. When money entered the picture for me, I had a choice. Keep comfort or build continuation. Here's something practical. If you ever inherit money, receive a promotion, build a business, or step into influence, pause before you spend. Ask yourself, what problem am I solving? If the answer is ego, you'll spend fast and feel empty. If the answer is impact, you'll move slower and build something durable. Legacy isn't loud. It doesn't need billboards. It doesn't need press releases. It needs structure. That's why the first thing I did after transferring the estate was create oversight. Independent audits, third-party review, clear reporting. Not because I don't trust myself. Because transparency protects legacy. If you want something to outlive you, it can't depend on your mood. It has to depend on systems. This applies beyond money. If you're a parent, your legacy isn't what you buy your kids. It's the behavior you model. If you're a leader, your legacy isn't your title. It's the culture you leave behind. If you're building a career, your legacy isn't your LinkedIn profile. It's whether people trust your name when you're not in the room. Another hard truth. You don't control how long you're here. You only control what you build while you are. I've operated in environments where tomorrow wasn't guaranteed, where men twice my size were quiet before missions because they understood risk. When you live close to uncertainty, you stop obsessing over image. You focus on substance. What would survive if I wasn't here tomorrow? That question changes decisions. Would your family be financially organized? Is there a will in place? Are accounts documented? Or would everything collapse into confusion? Most people avoid those conversations because they're uncomfortable. Avoidance doesn't prevent crisis, it multiplies it. Grandpa prepared. He didn't just accumulate assets. He structured them, assigned them, directed them with intention. Even the foundation wasn't an afterthought. He built it before he needed it. That's strategy, Legacy is planned, not improvised. Here's something else I've learned. Impact doesn't require millions. You don't need an estate to build legacy, you need consistency. If you show up for people reliably, that's legacy. If you stand by your word, that's legacy. If you refuse to compromise your integrity under pressure, that's legacy. Money amplifies scale. It doesn't create meaning. I've approved grants for veterans who only needed $4,000 to keep their home. $4,000 changed their trajectory. To someone else, that's a weekend vacation budget. Perspective matters. If you're waiting to make it big before you give, you misunderstand legacy. Legacy starts at your current capacity. It grows with discipline. Another practical piece of advice. If you own assets, write a clear will. Not vague, not assumed. Clear. If you support causes, formalize it. Don't rely on verbal promises. If you care about your family avoiding conflict, remove ambiguity now. Ambiguity breeds disputes. Disputes destroy relationships. Clarity protects both money and people. One of the most common mistakes I see is parents equating fairness with equality. Fairness isn't always equal. Fairness is aligned with responsibility. Grandpa didn't choose me because I was older. He chose me because I was present. Legacy follows reliability, not birth order, not favoritism, reliability. I sit in that office now and sign approvals knowing those signatures matter. Not for headlines, for housing, for treatment, for stability. That's legacy in motion. And here's the final thing I'll leave you with. The world does not remember who had the largest estate. It remembers who stood firm when it mattered. It remembers who kept promises. It remembers who didn't run. When you're gone, people won't talk about your portfolio. They'll talk about your character, so build that first. Structure your life so that if you disappeared tomorrow, something good would keep moving because you were here. That's legacy, not money, not status, impact. And impact is built on the same foundation everything else in this story came down to. Integrity under pressure.
Final note. This story is a work of fiction, but the valuable lessons we discuss are entirely real and continue to happen to many people every day. If this style isn't for you, that's perfectly okay. Please feel free to look for other content that better suits your needs.